Hey everyone, I am Magical Hacker, and this is episode number 15 of the Eminence Podcast, the non-CEDH Commander podcast, where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills and on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This podcast is brought to you by the Drizzle and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker. Today's topic is the question, what should be the number of poison counters that are lethal in multiplayer Commander? So poison, this is something that was introduced a long time ago, way before Infect actually, where we had poisonous creatures that if they dealt damage to you, you also got a number of poison counters equal to whatever their poisonous value was, and then if you had 10 of those poison counters, you lost the game. This was an old mechanic, and Wizards of the Coast decided to reuse that and to kind of tweak it, make it a little bit better because it wasn't that great earlier. They decided to make Infect, where if it dealt damage to an opponent, you didn't lose life. Instead, you only got that many poison counters. And if it dealt damage to a creature, now you actually do something different too. If you deal damage to a creature, instead of dealing regular damage, now the damage that's dealt is in -1/-1 counters. And this is also when they introduced a mechanic called Proliferate, where you could just add one counter to a player or to any number of permanents. And so you could just proliferate, and everybody's poison counters went up by 1. All the -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures went up by 1. And so these were all kind of, all things that were seeming to be really good. And then, of course, now, with the newest set, Phyrexia All Will Be One, we've got Toxic, which works a lot more like Poisonous, but, there are some small important tweaks that I'm not going to go into here. All this conversation has made people talk about poison counters again. When Commander was kind of early on in its lifespan, we saw people having the interest to play Infect decks, but it wasn't a ton of people. It was a very small percentage of people. Now that percentage maybe has gone up by opening Toxic. Some people are interested to be playing a Toxic based deck. That might be something that they're interested in doing nowadays. So a question that happened early on where people were saying, well, hold on. When we have life total, we look at our life total, it's not 20 like it is in regular Magic. Now it's 40 in multiplayer Commander. Well, how come the poison counters didn't change, right? We had 10 being lethal in regular 1v1 Magic, but then when you go to Commander multiplayer, it's still just 10. Well, hold on, what's up with that? Shouldn't it go up to 20? And in fact, this is one of the questions that a Magic personality by the name of Saffron Olive asked earlier this year in January. He asked this. With poison counters returning in Phyrexia All Will Be One, it might be time to change the rules in Commander so it takes 20 poison counters to kill someone. Should the rule be changed? The 4 options here were yes, 20 poison counters, no, 10 poison counters, indifferent/don't care, and see results. Of those 4 options, no 10 poison counters won the poll at 37%, and then yes, 20 poison counters was in second place at 33%. So really, the difference between those two categories is very small, 4%. So it does seem like a topic where people are very divided on it. There's not going to be something that there's a consensus, seemingly. There's no consensus one way or the other. And this poll received 19,000 votes. So certainly not all Magic players, but I think that's a respectable number. It's a pretty large sample size. So I think it does say something at least. I don't know if it says everything, but it certainly says something. So we've got Infect, we've got Toxic, and of course we've also got Poisonous, which I don't think that's really coming into the conversation much at all, besides just being extra toxic, creatures. Not extra toxic meaning more than just what Toxic does, but more just an additional number of creatures that could basically also have Toxic. So we've got Toxic and we've got Infect. Should we change the number of poison counters? When we're looking at toxic creatures, the majority of them have Toxic 1. Almost all of them. Now, there are a couple, maybe a handful that have Toxic 2. 2 of them have Toxic 3. There's one that has Toxic 4, and then one that has Toxic 6. That's it. The remaining are all Toxic 1. So when it comes to those Toxic 1 creatures, that means that you have to have 10 hits from any of these creatures with Toxic 1, and then you die. And really, that's so slow. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to try to show an argument why we would ever need to change that number at all. But what about for the rest of those, right? So there's that Toxic 6 creature. It's an uncommon 7-drop, 6/7, has Toxic 6, And it also says it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. So not really a very strong type of evasion. There's no haste on there to surprise somebody. There's no double strike in order to make it lethal. So you could get technically 2 hits from that one creature, or give it double strike and haste and some other type of evasion all together at the same turn that you cast it to try to surprise the opponent. But in general, Toxic isn't really doing a whole lot to make it so that there are, the games will be dying too quickly. But what about the Infect creatures? Right, there are a lot of, again, 1-powered creatures with Infect, but I'm seeing here there's a 4-power. There's another 4-power. We're continuing down a couple of 2-power. Here's a 3-power creature with Infect. There's a 7-power creature with Infect. Here is a 5-power creature with Infect. There's another 3-power creature with Infect. So if we're counting up the ones, there's another 4-power ones. There's another 4-power ones. If we count up the ones that have a significant amount of power on Infect, this is much higher than what we're seeing for Toxic. So of the two, let's say you're going to get hit by some creature. It's going to be a random creature with Infect or a random creature with Toxic. Which would you prefer? I would say most likely I'd be preferring the Toxic ones, because technically the Toxic values are much lower than the average power and toughness. Just the power, really. The average power of an Infect creature. Not to mention, we've got Blightsteel Colossus, which is an 11-powered trample Infect indestructible creature for 12 mana. It's very expensive, but that does mean that if you have no blockers, you just die. You literally just lose the game right there. So that, I think, is an important question to ask. What about poison counters? What if we're changing the life total? Why should poison counters be immune to any change? And I think I've got a really good mathematical interpretation and perspective here that may actually provide a solid answer, a solid reason for why either A, Infect shouldn't change, or B, if it does change, it's certainly not changing it to 20. I don't think that's going to be a reasonable thing. So when we're looking at Commander, of course, one of the questions that many players ask is, okay, I'm going to build a deck, but how do I win? Right? I'm not going to be building a deck just to do a bunch of stuff and then lose the game. I mean, some players do build like that, but most players probably don't. Most players are probably thinking, okay, I want to do something that will help me get to the point where I'm winning. What will that thing be? Am I playing a bunch of creatures and then attacking with those creatures and trying to kill someone? That might be part of it. Am I trying to Voltron up, have my commander, protect it, get it really huge, and start using that to kill people? Maybe. Am I trying to burn people out with non-creature or non-combat damage, where I'm trying to just directly deal damage to them without even using the combat step? That might be another consideration. Am I trying to combo off, and I'm trying now to do something an infinite number of times so that I win the game? That might be another way to win. But there's a lot of these things that you'll notice, they're all trying to work in the same area. There are certainly some decks that are trying to mill out their opponents. Of course, there are other decks that are trying to use alternate win conditions, of which I would consider Infect to be one of them. But the majority of decks are winning by reducing their life totals of their opponents down to 0. That's usually how it works. And so because of that, when you are sitting at a commander table, most likely you will have one opponent who will be trying to do that, a second opponent who will be trying to reduce your life total, and a third opponent, all of them trying to reduce your life total down. So when you're looking at your 40 life, don't think of it so much as my life total is twice as high as what it would be in 1v1. Instead, saying it's twice as high, but now I have 3 times as many opponents trying to reduce it down. So really, if we were trying to keep it the same as 1v1, we would actually be starting off at a life total of about 60, right? And that way we can think each opponent's thinking about doing 20 damage in order to defeat me. That would make it more so the exact same as what we'd see in 1v1. That increase in life total isn't necessarily to make it so that you are more resilient to aggro, although it does do that if only one opponent is an aggro player, a combat-focused player. But it does mean that there's something else to consider here. Now, if you're trying to win the game and you're trying to be just as involved in making sure an opponent loses the game as each of those other opponents, you'll need to do 13 damage. The other two will each need to deal 13 damage. And that will be a total of 39 damage dealt to that opponent, which means what? They're really just at 1 life. If they use the fetch land at any point in the game and they've paid 1 life for something, they're gone, right? And so really the life total, it is technically 40, but the amount that each opponent has to do in order to make sure that you're the one that loses the game is not the one that wins the game. It's just 13. It's not that much higher. So if we were to think about 20 going down to 13, there's no reason for us to then say, but poison needs to go up to 20, because that would only be a reasonable increase if instead we were looking at each opponent and thinking that, okay, all of my opponents are all playing Infect. That is very unlikely. It's literally not true. I think you'd have to be in a very weird play group for you to be able to sit down to a game of Commander and think, yeah, probably all of my opponents are trying to infect me out of the game. Even if we just, if we include poisonous, toxic, and even proliferate decks, I still don't think we'll get to that point where we can reasonably expect when we're sitting down in the game that we'll be seeing even 2 opponents playing strategies that are going to be doing that. And I'm talking about long term. Maybe short term because of Phyrexia All Be One and toxic creatures. People are excited to play them. That's how it always works, right? People are always excited to play new things. But I think long term, I don't see that being the case. And if anything, if we're going from 20 life down to 13 life in terms of what each opponent needs to reduce from your life total in order for you to lose the game, it doesn't really make sense for us to increase from 10 up to 20, or really to increase from 10 to 11. But let's just assume for a second that the fact that each opponent only has to deal 13 is because, there are going to be some decks that are not going to care about your life total. So let's say we can sit down at the table and we can assume 2 of my opponents will be trying to reduce my life total. 1 opponent won't care about that at all. If we go into the game of Commander assuming that, which I do think is not very likely, I think more often you'll have 3 opponents who all care about life total versus 2 that do and 1 that doesn't. But I think the average or the median may be closer to that for whatever reason. So let's say we assume we start that. Then each of those 2 opponents that do care about our life total, they each have to try to reduce 20 points. That's exactly how it would be in 1v1. The third opponent, if they're an Infect deck, they still need to do all 10 Infect by themselves. So if we go into the game with this, admittedly not very realistic because we're over, assuming the number of players that are going to be caring about poison counters. But even if we make that assumption, we're still exactly where we want to be. No need to change it. If we were trying to say, though, let's say we were to change the number of Infect counters that people would need to do to the exact same amount of damage that they would need to do, assuming that every opponent is going to be either caring about reducing life total or there's only 1 opponent who cares about doing something with Infect. Then I could see an argument to be made for, let's increase it to 13 poison counters. The only thing that would really change, I would say, is how effective Blightsteel Colossus is. So that's the 11 Infector creature that we mentioned earlier that has Indestructible and Trample. So that one I could certainly see, in order to prevent that one from being just a one-shot, immediately, 1-hit KO, just as soon as it hits you, if you can't block it at all, you're dead. Then maybe I could see increasing it to 13 poison counters. When I suggested this on Twitter, someone said it's kind of funny that 13 happens to be how the math shakes out, because 13 is already one of those numbers that people are scared of. Maybe that would make more sense for Infect because that's how Infect would work, right? It's a scary mechanic. People are afraid of it. Maybe 13 is a flavor win if we were to change it to that. But that's really the only thing that I could see. I think more reasonable is keeping it at 10. And I think one way that we can possibly provide proof to that idea, either one way or the other, is asking ourselves, how often do Infects win at the table and how often do they lose? If Infect decks, if somebody brings an Infect deck to the table and it's winning more than 25% of the time, and this is true across the board for all players playing all Infect decks, if Infect is really that powerful, yeah, maybe we need to change the number of poison counters because Infect is abusing an axis of Commander that wasn't designed to be used in that way. Sure. But I don't think you'll find that to be the truth. I think if you were to do an analysis of even just 10% of the Infect decks, and even if we were to look at the 10% most effective Infect decks, I still don't think you're going to, reach past that 25%, marker. So when it comes to how Infect works, the multiplayer aspect of Commander works against it, making it extra scary. People are more afraid of it, reducing its ability to win the game, and as a result, Infect is not something that's overpowered and needs to be nerfed by changing the number of poison counters that are lethal in Commander. But that's my take. If you disagree, or if you have any questions, please leave me a comment at youtube.com/magicalhackermtg or a tweet at twitter.com/magical__hacker. Speaking of which, let's take a look at some of the questions that you all left for me. Again, next episode we'll be talking about all of the questions from Breffin. That's exciting for me. So we're going to focus more so on questions not from Breffin, who also goes by the name Jerhavon. Okay. The Mega Dragon here, replying to my episode number 10, Should the Mulligan Rules of Magic Be Changed, says this: by not shuffling the 5 cards you have now allowed combo decks to start the game already 20% through their deck, this makes getting combo pieces significantly easier. I could be convinced drawing 10 and shuffling 3 back might be good, but drawing 12 and then putting the non-combo pieces at the bottom just makes it easier to dig for the other half. Would lead to formats being wrapped around combos. I would like to amend that specifically for Commander. It might be okay, but considering 60-card formats like Modern and Legacy, this would be too advantageous to combo decks. So when I posted my suggestion for what a new Mulligan, or what a replacement for the Mulligans in total could be, there was somebody who asked the question, how does this look for 60-card? Because if you were to make this change for Commander, and it would, completely destroy 60-card formats, then really at this point you're not talking about a change to Magic, you're talking about a change for Commander. And so I was interested, I did the math, and really the math shakes out about the same. It wasn't really all that different, using the exact same methods of analyzing and calculating, not changing the equations, but just changing the inputs to the equation. Okay, now instead of a 100-card deck, we have a 60-card deck. Okay, now instead of this number of lands, we've got that number of lands. Instead of, one ofs in terms of the combo pieces, now we've got 4 ofs, right? And so doing all that calculation, what I found was the Mulligan replacement rule actually decreases your chance of finding combo pieces. So even though technically the replacement rule that I talked about in that format would allow you to first draw 12 and then put 5 back, and you would not be allowed to ever do any mulligans at all, your starting hand will be comprised only of cards that you find in your top 12 cards. There was also, the element of the fact that you're only seeing 12, that's less than 14 you could see if you mulligan once. So let's say you're in a 60-card format, you draw 7 cards. If you've got one or both of your combo pieces in hand, you might say, I want to try to keep this hand if I can. But if you don't, if you have 0 of them, you might say there's no benefit to keeping this hand. Even if I could keep it, I would prefer to find something that would allow me to have fewer steps to take until I can combo off. So let's say you go again for another 7-card hand, and you'd have the same question. So if you're not finding one of those 2 combo pieces in your opening hand, then you're certainly going to 14 cards, and you're looking at a much higher percentage of cards from your deck. And let's say, there is always that chance that you're going to draw one of the cards that you had in your original hand. So let's say it's 13. That's still higher than 12, right? And so looking at only 12, that means you're only going to get a chance to look at 20% of the deck. That 20% is actually a lower percentage of the amount of the deck that you get to look at compared to the current Mulligan system, which sounds crazy, right? We're looking at the current Mulligan system. We're like, there's no way I'm looking at that much of my deck, but you really are, because you're able to continue to change hands. There is a risk, there is a downside, but because you're able to go through hands, you can more often guarantee having a certain card or a certain pair of cards in your opening hand. So that's why the current Mulligan system already gives more benefit to combos than this replacement. This replacement actually reduces the power of being able to find the combos in your deck. Now, let's say you've got combos where you need any one of 12 cards with any one of some other, 12 cards. Then in that category, no matter what change you make, you will always be helping those combo decks if you're also helping lands. So the reason I was even suggesting this mulligan change in the first place is because due to mulligans and having to, have that exchange that you're reducing the number of cards you start off in your hand, and the fact that you're all relying it just on what do you see, 7 cards, that's it's increasing the number of non-games higher than what it needs to be. So this replacement, I was saying, shows you that there is room for us to make improvements to the Mulligan change that would A, improve the number of non-games that we're having, B, speed up the steps or the process of starting the game, and C, do all that without making it this bad, without somehow helping combos, because I knew that's always going to be the thing around it. If you're making it easier to find lands, automatically you have to be also making it easier to find combos. The math does not agree with that. The math shows actually it's the opposite. You can help decks find something when there's a large category of it, like lands, but it doesn't help them find something that's a small category in the deck, like combo pieces. There is actually a way to get through to both sides being improved in both ways. Not making combos unplayable, but just not helping them to make them, completely covering up the entire format. I think we've got one more question here that we can answer. It's from that same episode. Prince Persona says the Shadow Fist TCG, formerly CCG, solved this problem in 1995 when their game debuted. In Shadow Fist, the player takes any number of cards, sets them in exile, then draws back up to their starting hand size, but unlike the partial Paris, you do this one time, not over and over again to find the perfect starting hand. This in Commander would of course be modified to have the cards set aside back into the deck after the player draws back up to their starting hand. This results in the players shuffling last, and since only one shuffle is performed, the game starts really quickly for everyone. Most players will send about 3 to 4 cards back in order to have a more playable starting hand, and since they don't get to see the new cards they will draw into, they are left with less information in their decisions, which makes this version more karmic balanced. I do like this idea from Prince Persona, and if this was if this is what we had used instead of my suggestion, I would still be super happy with that in comparison to the current Mulligan system. However, there's a couple of downsides to this strategy that I'm not a big fan of. So sometimes having to make a decision where you can see one option but you can't see the other is a lot of load on trying to make that decision. You can see this even from the highest levels of competitive play. People do have to think a lot about how they're going to mulligan, and even the pros think about it, and they're pondering, okay, is this better than what I don't know about? And they're trying to have to make that decision in their mind. Humans are just really bad at this. So if we can eliminate that without changing the math too much, I think that's actually a benefit, not a downside. So in this case, the Shadow Fist TCG, I would say you have that same downside as the current Mulligan system. Not as bad, but still there, where you're having to make decisions about something you don't see. Let's say instead, in this case, they're saying about 3 to 4 cards back. Let's say instead, you got to decide, I'm going to put back 4 cards, but I'm not going to decide which 4 cards I'm going to put back until after I've drawn the 4 cards that I'm going to see. Because what if 4 of the cards in my current hand, at least 1 or 2 of them are better than the 4 cards I'm going to draw off the top. So let's say we take this Shadow Fist TCG method, and we'll say you pick a number, draw that many cards, and then you have to shuffle that many away. So you get to see that many. Well, in that situation, you might say that's about the same in terms of the math, but now what's the biggest benefit? What's the highest number that where's the benefit you could have? You would say 7 every time. Because then you would be looking at 14 cards and putting 7 back every time. And so if taking just one element of this system, tweaking it so that you can remove one of the downsides, which I would say is changing out hidden information for non-hidden information, making one tweak causes you to have you overshoot what I suggested. I think that means my suggestion is the best way that you could get rid of that downside. So that's what I would say here. With the Shadow Fist TCG, because you're still having to trade known information for unknown information, it's worse than my suggestion. And I think that will still slow down mulligans, especially, I know Prince Persona mentioned just one shuffle, but you have to shuffle before you draw your cards, and then you have to shuffle after you put those cards away. So that's 2 shuffles per person. Whereas in my system, I said you would draw those 12 cards after shuffling once, and you'd put 5 back at the bottom of your library in a random order. We could technically do the same thing here with Shadow Fist TCG, but my point is it's either the same or my system would be better in that way. So I do like this idea. Like I said, if the Shadow Fist TCG method was used in Magic, I would be so much happier than our current Mulligan system. But I still think that there is some small details for where my suggestion is a little bit better in terms of what would allow you to do. So that's pretty much all the time we have for answering questions for today. Thank you again for leaving questions. If you want to pick a topic for an episode of the Eminence podcast, check out patreon.com/magicalhacker. I mentioned this before, but the question for the next episode, or the topic for the next episode rather, will be answering all of Breffin, again, Jerhavon, same name, answering all the YouTube comments that they've left. They left me a lot of YouTube comments, and so I would love to just spend one whole episode just answering all of those YouTube comments, because I think that'll be a lot of fun for everybody. We've got some really interesting perspectives on many of the topics we've already talked, so it's kind of like a grab bag episode. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube or follow on Spotify to get notified of any episode that I'm making when it comes out. Thank you again to The Drizzle. Thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.